Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 8. From this time Captain Wentworth and Anne Elliot were repeatedly in the same circle, and soon were dining in different company together at Mr. Mungrove's, for the little boy's date could no longer supply his aunt with the pretence for her absenting herself. But this was just the beginning of other dinings and other meetings. Whether the former feelings were to be renewed and must be brought to him by the proof. Former times must undoubtedly be brought to the recollection of each. They could not but be reverted to. The year of their engagement could not but be named by him. In the little narratives or descriptions which conversation called forth, his profession qualified him, his disposition led him to talk, and that was in the year 6, that happened before I went to sea in year 6, occurred in the course of the first evening they spent together, and though his voice did not falter, though she had no reason to suppose his eye wandering towards her while he spoke, and felt utter impossibility for her knowledge of his mind, and that could be unvisited by the remembrance of any more than herself. She must be the immediate association of thought. He was very far from conceiving it to be equal of pain. They had no conversation together, no intercourse but what of the most common civility required. So much to talk to each other, now nothing! There had been a time when all the large parties now filling the drawing-room at Uppercross, where they would find it most difficult to cease to speak to one another, with the exception, perhaps, of Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who seemed particularly attached and happy, and could only no other exceptions even among the married couples. There had been no two hearts too open, no tastes of so similar, and no feelings of so in unison, no countenance of so beloved. They were as strangers, nay, worse than strangers, for they could never become acquainted. It was a perpetual estrangement. When he talked, she heard the same voice, discerned the same mind. There was a very general ignorance of having all naval matters throughout the party, and he was very much questioned, especially by the two Miss Mungroves, who hardly seemed to have any eyes but for him. As to manner on the living board, daily regulations, food, hours, etc., and their surprise at his accounts, the learned degree of the accommodations, the arrangements which was practical, drew from him some present ridicule, which reminded Anne of the early days when she had been too ignorant, or at least had been accused of supposing sailors to be living on board without anything to eat, or anything cook or dressed in if there were, to any servant to wait, and or any knife and fork to use. Thus, listening and thinking, she was roused by a whisper of Mrs. Mungrove's, who, overcome by fond regret, and not help saying, "Ah, Miss Anne, if it had been pleased Heaven to spare my poor son, and I dare say he would have been just another by this time." Anne suppressed a smile, and listened kindly, while Mrs. Mungrove had relieved her heart a little more, and for a few minutes therefore could not keep pace with the conversation of the others, and when he could let her attention take its natural course again, she found the Miss Mungroves just fetching the navy list on their own navy list, and first had ever been at Uppercross, and sitting down together to pore over it, with the professed view of finding out ships that Captain Wentworth had commanded. "Your first was the Asp, I remember. We will look for the Asp. You will not find her there, quite worn out and broken up. I was the last man who commanded her, hardly fit for service then, report fit for home service about a year or two, and I was sent off to the West Indies." The girls all looked in amazement. "The Admiralty," he continued, "entertained themselves now and then with sending a few hundred men to sea, and if the ship not to be employed, they might have had many great to provide for. And among the thousands that may well go as bound as not, impossible for them and distinguish the very set of those who may least be missed." "Phoo! Phoo!" cried the Admiral. "What stuff young fellows talk! There was never a better sloop than the Asp of her day, for a built old sloop would never see her equal. Lucky fellow to get her. He must know there might have been 20 better men than himself applying to her at the same time. Lucky fellow to get anything so soon, with no more interest than this, his. "I felt my luck, Admiral, I assure you," replied Captain Wentworth seriously. "I am well satisfied with my appointment as you desire, with a great object with me at the time to be at sea. A very great object. I want to be doing something." "To be sure you did. What a young fellow like you do ashore half a year together? If a man hath not a wife, then it might be afloat again. I knew pretty well that what she was there at that day," he said, smiling. "I had no more discoveries than you would have to make the fashion and strength of any old Palace, which you see among the lent half of your acquaintance since you could remember, which, at last, of the very wet day, is lent yourself. Ah, she was a dear old ass to me. She did all that I wanted. I knew she would, and that we would go either to the bottom together, or she would be the making of me, and I never 2 days of foul weather all the time when I was at sea in her, and taking the privateers enough to be very entertaining. I had the good luck in my passage home on the next autumn, and to fall in with the very French frigate I wanted. I was brought her into Plymouth, and another instance of luck. We had not been here 6 hours in the Sound when a gale came on, and lasted about 4 days and nights, which would have been dawn for a poor old ass of the half the time and touch of our great nation might have not improved our condition. 4 and 20 hours later, I should only have been gallant Captain Wentworth in a paragraph, and the corner of the newspaper, having lost only in a sloop. Nobody would have thought about me. And shuddering to herself was alone, but the Miss Mungroves could be as open as they were sincere. It was their exclamations of pity and horror. "Then, I suppose," Mrs. Mungrove said in a low voice, if thinking aloud, "so he went away to Laconia, and there he met our poor boy, Charles, my dear," beckoning him to her. "Do ask Captain Wentworth where he was when he first met with your poor brother. I always forgot. It was at Gibbar, mother." I know. Dick had been left ill at Gibbar, with a recommendation from his former captain, Captain Wentworth. "Oh, but Charles, tell me, Captain Wentworth, he need not be afraid of mentioning poor Dick to me, or rather have a pleasure of hear him talked by such a good friend." Charles, being somewhat more mindful of the probability cases, only nodded in reply, and walked away. The girls were now hunting for the Laconia, and Captain Wentworth could not deny himself the pleasure of taking up the precious volume into his own hands to save them the trouble, and once more read aloud the statement of her name and rate. The present non-commissioned class, observing, oh, that she had been two of the best friends that ever had. Ah, those were pleasant days when I had the Laconia. How fast I made money in her. That friend of mine had such a lovely cruise together off the West Islands. Poor Harville, sister, you know how much he wanted the money. Worse than myself. I had a wife. Excellent fellow. I shall never forget his happiness. He felt it all, and so much for her sake. I wished for him the next summer when he had the same luck Mediterranean. I am sure, Mrs. Mungrove, he said Mrs. Mungrove, and it was a lucky day for us when you were put captain into that ship. We shall never forget what you did. Her feelings made her speak low. Captain Wentworth, only hearing part, maybe not having Dick Mungrove all near his thoughts, looked rather in suspense, as if waiting for more. "My brother," whispered one of the girls. "Mom was thinking of poor Richard." "Poor dear fellow," replied continued Mrs. Mungrove. He was grown so steady, an excellent correspondent while he was under your care. Ah, it would have been a happy thing if he never left you. I assure you, Captain Wentworth, we are very sorry he ever left you." There was a momentary expression on Captain Wentworth's face at his speech, and a certain glance in the bright eyes and curl of his handsome mouth, which convinced Anne that, instead of sharing Mrs. Mungrove's kind wishes as to her son, he probably had been at some pains to get rid of him. But transition and indulgence of self-amusement to be detected by anything who understood him, and less than herself. In a moment she was perfectly collected and serious, now doing almost anything afterwards, and coming up to the sofa which on the Miss Mungroves were sitting, and took place by the latter, and into the conversation with her in a low voice about her son, and doing with so much sympathy and natural grace, as she shewed the kindest consideration for all that all was real and unabsurd of her parents' feelings. They were actually on the same sofa, for Mrs. Musgrove had the most readily made room for him, and they were divided only by the Mrs. Mungroves. It was no insignificant barrier, indeed. Mrs. Mungrove was of a comfortable, substantial size, infinitely more fitted by nature to express her good cheer and good humour, that tenderness and sentiment, while the agitations of Anne's slender form and pensive face may be considered as very screen. Captain Wentworth should have allowed some credit to be at self-command, while he attended to her large, fat sighings over the destiny of a son, whom alive nobody had cared for. Personal size and mental sorrow had no necessary proportions, but a large, bulky figure had a good right to in deep affliction, as the most grateful set of limbs in the world, fair or not fair, becoming the unconjunctions, which it was reasonite to patronize in vain, which taste cannot tolerate, which will ridicule will seize. The Admiral, taking 2 or 3 refreshing turns around his own room with his hands behind him, being called to the order by his wife, now came up to Captain Wentworth, without any observation which he might be interrupting, only thinking of his own thoughts, began with, "If you had began a week later at Lisbon last spring, Frederick, you would have been asked to give a passage to Lady Mary Gerson and his daughters. Should I? I am glad I am not a week later." Then the Admiral abused him for his want of gallantry. He defended himself, though professing that he would never willingly admit the ladies on board of his ship, and excepting for a ball or a visit, which a few hours might comprehend. "But if I know myself," he said, "this is no want of gallantry towards them. It is rather, with how feeling impossible it is, with all one's efforts, all one's sacrifices, to make the accommodations on the board as such as women ought to have. There can be no want of gallantry, Admiral, in the radiant claims of women to every personal height, and this is what I do. I hate to hear of women on the board, but when I see them on the board, there is no ship under my command that shall ever convey a family of ladies anywhere, if they can help it." This brought his sister upon him. "Oh, Frederick, I cannot believe it of you. All idle refinement. Women may be as comfortable on board as in the best house in England. I believe I lived much on the board as most women, but I know almost nothing superior as all the accommodations of man of war. I declare I have not a comfort or indulgence about me, even at Kellynch Hall," with a kind bow to Anne, "beyond what I have had in the most of ships where I have lived in. They've all been 5 together." "Nothing to the purpose," replied her brother. "You were living with your husband, the only woman on board. But you, yourself, Mrs. Harville, her sister, her cousin, 3 children, from Portsmouth to Plymouth, which was a superfine, extraordinary side gallantry of yours, then. It all merged into my friendship, Sophia. I would have assisted my brother's officer's wife that I could. I would have bring anything to Harville's from world's end. But if he wanted it, I do not imagine I could not feel it an evil in itself. Depend on it, it was all perfectly comfortable. Such, perhaps, that a number of women and children to be right comfortable on board. My dear Frederick, you are talking quite idly. Pray, what will become of poor sailors' wives who wanted to be conveyed to one port or another after husbands, if every day everybody had your feelings? But my feelings did not prevent my from taking Mrs. Harville and all her family to Plymouth. But I hate to hear you talking so like a fine gentleman, if all the women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in a smooth water of our days. "Ah, my dear," said the Admiral, "when he has got a wife he will sing a different tune. When he is married, then if we have good luck to live another war, we shall see him do, as you and I, and many of the great others has done. If I had him, very thankful to anybody who will bring him his wife. Aye, that shall be done." "Now I have done," cried Captain Wentworth. "Once married people begin to attack me with, 'Oh, you will think very differently when you are married,' all I can say is, 'No, I shall not,' and they say then they say again, 'Yes, you will,' and there's an end of it." He got up and moved away. "And what a great traveller you must have been, ma'am," said Mrs. Mungrove to Mrs. Croft. "Pretty well, ma'am, after 15 years of my marriage. Though many women have done more, I've crossed the Atlantic 4 times, and once been to the East Indies, back again, and only once, besides in different places about home, Cork, Lisbon, and Gibraltar, and I've never wanted beyond the Straits. It was never and never was in the West Indies. We do not call um, Bermuda or Bahama, the West Indies. Mrs. Bungrove had not a word to say in dissent. She could not accuse herself of ever calling them in the whole course of life. I do assure you, ma'am, pursued Mrs. Croft, that nothing can exceed the common accommodations of man-of-war. I speak to you, of higher rates. When you come to a more frigate, of course, and more confined, than all any reasonable woman may be perfectly happy in one of them. I can safely say that the happiest part of my life has been on board a ship. When we were first together, there was nothing to be feared. Thank God, I've never always been blessed with excellent health. No climate disagrees with me. A little disordered always in the first 24 hours of going to sea, and I never knew what sickness was afterwards, and the only time I really suffered in body or mind, and the only time I would ever fancy myself unwell or had any ideas of danger, was when Winter and I passed myself at Deal, when the Admiral Captain Croft again was at North Seas. I lived a perpetual fright at that time, and all my manner imaginary complaints from not knowing what to do with myself, which I hear of him next. But as long as we could be together, nothing would it never ailed me. I never met with the smallest inconvenience. Ay, to be sure. Yes, indeed. Oh, yes. I am quite of your opinion, Mrs. Croft, was Mrs. Mungro's hearty answer. There is nothing so bad as separation. I am quite of your opinion. I know what that is, for Mr. Mungroves always attend the assizes. I am so glad when they are over, and he is safe back again. The evening ended with a dance, and on being proposed, Anne offered her services as usual, and though her eyes were sometimes filled with tears as she sat at the instrument, she was extremely glad to be employed, and nothing in return but to be unobserved. It was a merry, joyous party, and no one seemed to be in higher spirits than of Captain Wentworth, and she felt that everything to elevate him with general attention and deference, and especially the attention of all a young woman could do. Miss Hayters, the female of the family of cousins, had already mentioned, which were apparently admitted to the honor of being in love with him. As for Henrietta and Louisa, they both seemed to be entirely occupied by him. There had nothing to continued appearance in the most perfect good will between themselves, and could have made credible as they were not decided rivals. If there was a little spoiled, such universal, such eager admiration, who could wonder? There were these some of the thoughts which occupied Anne while her fingers were mechanically at work, proceeding for half an hour together, equally without error, and without consciousness. Once she felt that she was looking at herself, observing her altered features, perhaps, trying to trace them in the ruins of her face which once charmed him, once she knew it had been spoken of her. She was hardly unaware of it. Then she heard her answer. But she was playing sure of having asked his partner whether Miss Elliot had never danced, and the answer was, "Oh, no, never. She'd been quite given up dancing, and I'd rather play. She is never tired of playing. Once, too, she spoke to her, and she left her instrument on the dancing being over and over, and sat down trying to make an air what she to give the Miss Mungroves an idea. Unintentionally, she returned to that part of the room, and he saw her, and instantly rising and said, with studied politeness, "I beg your pardon, madame. This is your seat?" Though he immediately drew back with a decided negative, and not to be induced to sit down again. Anne did not wish for more of such looks as speeches. His cold politeness, ceremonious grace, were worse than anything.